lecture for behaviorism and personality theory. That is what we are looking at today. Behaviorism and personality theories. Now, talking about this, we are going to be looking at the impact of Watson, impact of Skinner, and the rejection of internal constructs. We're going to be reading Scott chapter 7 this week. And of course, our learning outcome is assess behaviorism's contribution to empirical rigor in personality theory. If you follow this lecture on personality theories, we've been talking about different theories and the approaches to personality of humanity. Let's look at behaviorism, the rise of behaviorism in the early 20th century. During that time, psychology was struggling with identity. And during that time, it was divided into two. Number one, introspection based, introspection from inside. That is structuralism. And the second aspect is psychoanalysis. That is unobservable, unconscious processes. Unobservable, unconscious processes. That is where it started from, if you remember, by Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalysis. So, but when it comes to 20th century in psychology, it was divided into two: structuralism and psychoanalysis, which means behaviorism emerged as a radical corrective. It insisted that psychology must study observable behaviors, not just speculation about the mind, but observable behaviors. So behaviorism transformed psychology from a speculative discipline into an experimental science. Okay, when we are talking about speculation, talking about unconscious, that Sigmund Freud was talking about unobservable unconscious processes. It's a form of speculation. Many people have termed that as speculation. But now we are moving from speculation to experimental science. Experimental science is the fulcrum of behaviorism. And that's what we are trying to say. When you look at the historical context in early 1900s, which was the age of industrialization, age of scientific optimism, the age of growth of laboratory research. Those are things that happened in 1900s. Psychology wanted objectivity. Psychology wanted measurability. Psychology wanted predictability. Okay? Behaviorism provided that framework. Don't forget, objectivity, measurability, and predictability. These are the framework that behaviorism is looking for. Between 1878 and 1958, John B. Watson came up with its own postulation. There's a core thesis of John B. Watson. He argued in 1913 that psychology should be a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. That's what B. Watson came up with in 1913. Psychology should be a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. He rejected introspection also. He rejected consciousness as a legitimate object of study. He rejected mentalistic explanation. These are things that psychoanalysis are talking about. Okay? Now, looking at the environmental determinism, Watson famously stated that give me a dozen heavy infants, and I will guarantee to train any one of them to become any type of specialist. That's what Watson is talking about. This reflects radical environmentalism. This reflects minimal emphasis on hereditary. This reflects strong belief in conditioning. If you are a student of psychology, you will understand some of these things I'm saying. Like I've said, you may not be able to capture everything because psychology is my major. So that's why I understand all these things I'm saying. But if I begin to break them down, it's going to take forever to finish this one lecture. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that Watson came up with a different ideology when it comes to determining of personality. And all of them are talking about, he's talking himself, Skinner, Watson, Watson. They are talking about behaviorism, saying that we can't base on introspection. We can't be based on guessing work, on unconsciousness processes. We want to base on scientific experimental. We want to base, on what we experiment. And begin to talk about, strong belief in conditioning. Begin to talk about not laying emphasis on hereditary. They begin to talk about, radical environmentalism. That is, the environment can determine what somebody is, conditioning. If you put somebody beside somebody who is doing like this every day, before you know what's happening, this person will be conditioned to be doing the same thing. Conditioning. Observable traits. Traits. That's what they're talking about. It's what you can see. Okay. The Little Albert experiment. There's something we call Little Albert experiment. Watson demonstrated emotional response can be conditioned. Emotional response can be conditioned. That's Little Albert experiment. Fear also can be learned. Somebody can learn fear. You can learn fear. Somebody, emotional response can be conditioned. These are powerful things that these scientists came up with. And, the implication of that is that personality traits, even anxiety, as anxiety as it is, are acquired behaviors. That's why if somebody is always anxious around you, before you know what's happening, you can be anxious too. Even when nothing is happening to you, you are being conditioned. If somebody is full of a particular habit around you, if care is not taken, you will learn that. Learned behavior. All right. So personality can be as a result of what you learned from other people. It's not about hereditary. It's not about unconscious introspection. It can be learned. You can be conditioned to a particular way of life. That's what we are talking about. When we look at B.F. Skinner, B.F. Skinner, that's 1904 to 1990. B.F. Skinner expanded behaviorism into radical behaviorism. Skinner did not just stay on behaviorism. He put radical in front of it. Radical behaviorism. And, when we talk about radical behaviorism, it's talking about what we have been explaining about Watson and all that. He integrates himself more into that. All right, that's what we're talking about. And, we begin to talk about operant conditioning. We're talking about conditioning. There's one we call operant conditioning. Skinner distinguished classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. There are two types of conditioning: classical, Pavlovian, we call it Pavlov, and operant conditioning, that is behavior shaped by consequences. That is operant. We're talking about you shape somebody's behavior by punishing a child. You give your child an assignment to do, you withdraw their tablet, you withdraw their internet, you withdraw their iPad. That is negative consequences. You can use that to shape a behavior, a personality, but it's dangerous. Very, very dangerous. That's operant conditioning. Behavior shaped by consequences. We call it negative consequences. All right. The core concept of operant conditioning is reinforcement increases behavior. Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. Punishment, decreases behavior. Why? Schedules of reinforcement, and of course, shaping. These are the core concepts of operant conditioning. Looking at the Skinner, I was talking about BF Skinner box. We call it the Skinner box. Using controlled experiments with animal. Skinner demonstrated. I bought a book when I was, doing my master's. I bought a textbook that, they put all this diagram of all this that I'm saying inside that textbook. It's a very powerful textbook. I think I still have it in my library here. All right. Skinner box, where they put an animal in a box, so to look at how they will behave, how after some days, to show that behavior is shaped by environment contingencies, and of course patterns of reinforcement also determine behavioral persistence. So another one is rejection of internal construct. Skinner rejected free will. Skinner rejected inner personality traits. Skinner rejected mentalistic explanation. He argues that internal states are unnecessary for scientific explanation. Okay? For Skinner, according to Skinner, personality is simply behavioral pattern shaped by reinforcement history. That's what Skinner is saying. Behavioral pattern shaped by reinforcement history. That's what Skinner is saying. And I want to tell you that behaviorist rejection of internal construct, behaviorism rejected the unconscious, which is according to Freud, rejected self-actualization, humanism. You remember Abraham Maslow, self-actualization. Behaviorism rejected that. Behaviorism rejected traits. You remember Albert Cattell that we discussed 2 or 3 weeks ago. Behaviorism rejected traits. Behaviorism rejected internal cognitive schema. He rejected all those. Why? Because internal constructs are not directly observable. You can't observe them. They believe in what they can see. Because internal constructs are not experimentally verifiable. You can't verify it. Because internal constructs are prone to speculation. Anything you cannot prove, behaviorism rejected it. So behaviorists insisted that if it cannot be measured, it is not scientific. If it is not measured, it is not scientific. Or in another way, if it is not empirical, it is not scientific. That is what they are saying. Let's look at the behaviorism model of personality. According to the behaviorism model of personality, personality of any man is a repertoire of learning behavior. Okay? Repertoire of learning behaviors. Number 2, personality is the product of environmental conditioning. That is, your environment can determine who you are. Personality is maintained by reinforcement patterns. If you reinforce good behavior to someone, the person will become like that. So there is no fixed inner self, no fixed inner self, no stable trait essays, no intrinsic motivation in early behaviorism, no intrinsic motivation. Motivation from inside. They don't believe that anything comes from inside. It is whatever we see we base our judgment on. Okay, let's look at the contributions to empirical rigor. Contributions to empirical. So this is central to your learning outcome. The first one under that is methodological discipline. That is, behaviorism introduced laboratory experimentation. Behaviorism introduced operational definitions. Okay? Behaviorism introduced control variables. Control variables. Behaviorism introduced replication standards. When you look at all those four I've mentioned, laboratory experimentation, operational definitions, controlled variables, and replication standards. If you look at, they are all, form what behaviorism is all about when it comes to empirical rigor. And when you look at measurement precision, it emphasizes that, observable outcome, quantifiable data, and behavioral prediction. These three are measurement precision. This dramatically improved psychological scientific credibility. That observable outcome, quantifiable data, behavioral prediction. When you are doing analysis, you are doing practical, you are drawing graph, you are doing all these things are measurable prediction. You can use it. Precision. You can use it. Looking at the clinical application, behaviorism influenced behavior therapy, exposure therapy, token, economics, and ABA. For those who apply with, you are familiar with ABA, applied behavioral analysis, and of course, modern CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, owes much to behavioral foundation. So we use a lot of behaviorism in cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's one of the intervention that I use in the clinic. CBT, very, very interesting. CBT. Let's look at the strength of behaviorism. The strength of behaviorism. Number one, scientific rigor. The scientific rigor there. Number two, experimental clarity. It's very clear. Number three, practical intervention. Number four, reproductivity. You can reproduce it. And of course, it focuses on observable change. Okay? Behaviorism made psychology predictive, practical or empirical, and evidence-driven. That's why we say CBT is one of the evidence-based, therapy. Evidence-based. Okay? Looking at the limitation and the critique, for sure, reductionism, it reduces human being to stimulus response organism. That's negativity there. That's limitation of behaviorism. It reduces human. So stimulus response organism. There's a neglect of internal processes like cognition, which is thoughts. emotions, meaning in life, motivation were minimized. So the cognitive revolution later corrected it. Later corrected it. There's ethical concern too. In behaviorism, there's a behavioral manipulation that raises questions such as who controls this experiment, who controls reinforcement, who defines desired behavior. That's manipulation, tendency for manipulation. There's also inadequate explanation of creativity and language. Skinner, behaviorist, account of language was challenged by a man called Noam Chomsky. He challenged it. He challenged it. Looking at the contemporary relevance, modern psychology integrates three things. It integrates behavioral principles, cognitive processes, and neuroscience. Neuroscience. I told you when you talk about neuro, you're talking about brain. So behaviorism survives in behavioral intervention. It survives in exposure therapies. Survives in behavioral activation for depression. It's a big intervention in depression. Behavioral activation. I like that. Behavioral activation. So in summary, behaviorism rejects internal mental constructs centered on observable behavior, emphasize environmental conditioning. It brought methodological rigor to personality psychology, and of course remain influential in empirical research and clinical intervention. While incomplete as a full theory of personality, behaviorism permanently transformed psychology into a scientific discipline. So behaviorism was the border between the classic and the contemporary, because that's at the point when psychology becomes a scientific discipline. This is a very interesting topic. I hope you'll be able to read more about behaviorism. I'll be able to give you a skeletal work on that and what scholars did on this. And by the time you read chapter 7 of our textbook for this class, you will have more understanding of the movement, the rise of behaviorism, from structuralism, which is introspection, to, what you can say, observable behavior. That word, observable behavior, when you understand behaviorism, remember observable behavior, and you'll be fine. Okay, I will talk to you again in the next class. Take care and God bless.